Number 10. The relics of St. Catherine of Siena. Some dead continue influencing history because they were rulers, generals, or symbols of national power. St. Catherine of Siena is more unsettling because her influence after death was carried through holiness, fragmentation, and physical remains treated not as simple evidence of burial, but as active channels of presence. That is what makes her relics so powerful. The body did not simply rest. It was divided, preserved, displayed, venerated, and drawn into the devotional life of later generations in ways that made death feel less like absence than redistribution. That is what gives relic culture its extraordinary force. A saint does not vanish cleanly into memory. The body becomes a map of access. Hands, heads, bones, clothing, incorrupt fragments, and contact objects all begin to function as points where the faithful believe distance between heaven and earth has narrowed. In Catherine's case, this was intensified by the scale of her religious significance. She had already been a force in politics, spirituality, and reform while alive. After death, her remains allowed that force to continue in material form. What makes the case especially haunting is the intimacy of the logic. Modern people are used to thinking of memory in symbolic terms, but relic devotion insists that the sacred may remain lodged in flesh and bone themselves. That changes everything. The body is no longer merely what the soul once occupied. It becomes proof, conduit, and contested inheritance. Once communities believe that grace can radiate through remains, the dead are no longer still. They enter liturgy, pilgrimage, healing, and territorial devotion. And there is something deeply unsettling about the fragmentation. A saint's body divided among places does not feel like peaceful burial. It feels like sanctity dispersed through matter. Different communities may claim closeness through possession. Different institutions gain prestige from housing particular remains. The person who once moved through the world alive now moves through history in parts, each part charged with spiritual and political meaning. Catherine's relics therefore do not merely preserve her memory. They multiply her presence. That multiplication matters because relics do not function only through private prayer. They shape architecture, pilgrimage routes, public devotion, feast day culture, and the authority of the places that guard them. The body becomes an institution. A cathedral, shrine, or city holding a relic can claim a special relationship to sanctity itself. In that sense, the dead person keeps altering the living by changing where people travel, what they revere, and how they imagine divine nearness. There is also a darker emotional edge here. Relics promise contact, but that contact comes through death made visible and enduring. Bone and body part become objects of longing. Reverence and bodily unease sit side by side. That tension is part of what makes relic culture so powerful historically. It refuses the comforting idea that holiness should remain abstract. Instead, it says sanctity may still cling to what decays, what is cut, what is preserved, what the living cannot stop touching because they believe heaven once touched it first. In the end, the relics of St. Catherine of Siena belong on this list because they show one of history's oldest and strangest truths. The dead can keep governing the emotional life of the living when their bodies are treated as sacred matter rather than closed remains. Catherine died, but her body did not retire from history. It entered another form of authority, one built from devotion, proximity, and the unsettling belief that holiness may still dwell in what death left behind. Number 9. The skull of Oliver Cromwell. Some dead go on influencing the living through reverence. Oliver Cromwell's skull did something darker. It became a political object in a nation that never fully settled what Cromwell had meant while alive. That is what makes this case so haunting. He had already been a revolutionary, a regicide, a ruler, a destroyer of one order and builder of another. After his death, his body, and especially the later history of his severed head, turned him into something even stranger, a fragment of a man still carrying the charge of civil war, kingship overturned, and legitimacy violently contested. That is what gives the skull its force. A grave can contain memory. A skull displayed, moved, hidden, owned, or whispered about transforms memory into confrontation. It strips away the softening distance of ordinary burial. The face is gone. The rhetoric is gone. What remains is the hard, symbolic core of mortality fused to politics. Cromwell's head was not merely anatomical. It became a relic of revolution in the most uneasy sense of the word. What makes the story especially dark is the history of posthumous punishment surrounding Cromwell. After the Restoration, his corpse was exhumed and subjected to a grotesque symbolic execution. This already reveals something essential. The dead man still mattered enough to be attacked. The regime did not simply want him buried by time. It wanted to reverse him ritually to make his body serve the restoration of monarchy. That means Cromwell's afterlife began not in peace but in public political theatre. And from there, the skull's strange journey only intensified the sense that Cromwell would not stay historically settled. Once detached from a stable burial context, the head became a wandering object of fascination, fear, and debate. People could own it, exhibit it, doubt it, authenticate it, and invest it with meaning. This is where the dead begin changing the living in a uniquely uncanny way. The remains cease to be private. They become portable arguments. That portability matters because Cromwell was never a neutral dead man. To some, he was liberty's hard-edged defender. To others, a tyrant and king-killer. The skull, therefore, did not just represent him. It reactivated conflict. The living could not look at it without also confronting the unfinished question of what England had done to itself in the 17th century. The body part became a shortcut back into ideological struggle. There is also something especially disturbing about the intimacy of the object. A preserved head is hard to spiritualize cleanly. Unlike saintly relics, it does not primarily invite comfort or intercession. It invites unease. The skull carries personality stripped to bone, authority stripped to mortality, political power reduced to remains, and yet somehow still powerful because reduction itself becomes symbolic. It says, this man died, but the argument around him did not. In the end, the skull of Oliver Cromwell belongs on this list because it shows how a divided society can keep using the dead long after their bodies should have gone still. Cromwell's political life ended, his physical life ended, but his skull continued travelling through the anxieties of the living, a fragment of unresolved revolution refusing to become only history. Number 8. The bones of Thomas Becket. Some dead continue changing the living because they leave behind kingdoms, laws, or revolutions. Thomas Becket changed the living because his death turned bone into authority. That is what makes his remains so historically powerful. He was not simply remembered as a murdered archbishop. He became a martyr, and once that happened, his bones no longer belonged to private mourning or ordinary burial. They entered the charged space where violence, sanctity, and political guilt fuse into something that can reshape an entire society. That is what gave Becket's remains their force. His murder in Canterbury Cathedral was already shocking enough, because it felt like a violation not only of a man but of sacred space itself. Once martyrdom took hold, the sight of death and the body of the victim became inseparable from the larger struggle between church and crown. People no longer approached Becket as a dead cleric alone. They approached him as proof that power had overreached and that heaven had answered through sanctity what politics had tried to settle by force. And that is where the bones begin to matter in a way modern minds often underestimate. Relics are not passive memorials. In medieval Christendom, they were engines of devotion, pilgrimage, healing, and prestige. A martyr's remains could redirect movement across an entire kingdom. Pilgrims travelled, shrines were built, offerings accumulated, stories spread, Miracles attached themselves to the body. The dead person began organizing the living through roads, liturgy, prayer, economy, and imagination. Becket's bones did not stay hidden in the earth. They became a center of gravity. What makes this especially haunting is the reversal built into the story. Henry II's conflict with Becket had been about control, authority, and the limits of clerical independence. But once Becket was dead, the body of the man the crown had opposed became harder to govern than the living archbishop had ever been. The martyrdom gave him a reach beyond political office. Dead, he could embarrass kings, inspire penitence, and anchor a cult of devotion that transformed Canterbury into one of the great spiritual destinations of Europe. There is also something deeply revealing about the materiality of the bones. A martyr cult does not rest on abstract admiration alone. It insists that holiness can remain concentrated in physical remains. That belief makes the body politically dangerous. If the bones are revered, then the story of the death is continually renewed. The shrine becomes an accusation preserved in stone and ritual. Every pilgrim who kneels there is, in some sense, keeping the memory of the crime alive. That is why later power had reason to fear such remains. A martyr's bones are never only religious objects, they are historical leverage. They hold public memory in place. They refuse amnesia. And in Becket's case, that mattered for centuries. His afterlife shaped literature, pilgrimage culture, royal image, and the emotional relationship between England and sacred resistance. The dead man kept speaking through the fact that his remains could still gather the living around them. In the end, the bones of Thomas Becket belong on this list because they show how a murdered body can become more influential after death than before it. Becket was killed in the hope of ending a struggle. Instead, his remains turned the struggle into a permanent sacred memory that the living could not stop returning to. The body was gone, but the bones kept making claims on conscience, power, and history. Number 7. The remains of El Cid. Some dead continue shaping the living through sanctity. El Cid did it through legend, war memory, and the strange durability of a body attached to victory even after life had ended. That is what makes his remains so powerful. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was already a formidable military figure in life, but after death he became something larger, a heroic body claimed by memory, kingdom, and myth, until the line between history and symbolic afterlife grew thin. What gives the case its force is the kind of man El Cid became in memory. He was not just a knight who died. He became a champion of Reconquista imagery, martial honor, and Spanish heroic identity. Once a dead figure begins carrying that much symbolic weight, the remains themselves become charged. Burial is no longer simple disposal. It becomes stewardship of legend. The body stands for more than a person. It stands for continuity, courage, and the political uses of remembered war. The most haunting part of El Cid's afterlife is the legendary idea that even in death he could still affect battle and morale. Whether retellings are strictly historical is almost beside the point. What matters is that generations found it believable, or at least emotionally necessary, that his dead body might still ride, still frighten enemies, still preserve order through sheer symbolic force. That is one of the clearest signs that the dead have crossed into active historical power. They no longer need to act literally. The living act differently because the dead are imagined as still present. And that matters because martial relics function differently from saintly ones. A saint's remains heal or intercede. A hero's remains stabilize memory, courage, and national myth. El Cid's body and tomb helped anchor an idea of Spain that later centuries could keep returning to whenever heroic continuity was needed. The dead warrior became a political and cultural resource. His bones did not simply testify that he had once lived. They testified that the struggle he symbolized could still be made meaningful in the present. There is also something especially unsettling about how easily war memory hardens around remains. Once the body of a famous warrior is preserved, relocated, honored, or woven into epic narrative, it becomes harder to separate the actual historical person from the uses later generations have for him. El Cid's remains therefore belong not just to burial history, but to the machinery of heroic construction. The body helps make the myth feel embodied, tangible, harder to dismiss as mere story. That embodied quality is what gives the case its emotional power. A legend told in words can drift. A tomb, relic, or honored set of remains makes legend feel anchored. People can point to a place, a shrine, a body once here, a warrior buried there. The dead then begin influencing architecture, ceremony, nationalism, and public memory. El Cid keeps changing the living not by rising from the grave, but by refusing to stay only in books. In the end, the remains of El Cid belong on this list because they show how a dead warrior can outgrow biography and become a usable force in the lives of later people. His body did not simply mark the end of one life. It became part of a long afterlife of martial identity, heroic longing, and the need to believe that some defenders remain dangerous even after death. Number 6. The corpse of Pope Formosus. Some dead continue shaping the living through reverence or legend. Pope Formosus did it through humiliation, fear, and one of the most grotesque political rituals in church history. That is what makes his corpse so unforgettable. He had already died, been buried, and should have passed into the settled memory of papal succession. Instead, his body was dragged back into public life, dressed in papal vestments, placed on a throne, and subjected to the notorious Cadaver Synod, where a dead pope was put on trial by the living. That is what gives the case its extraordinary darkness. A corpse is supposed to mark the end of argument. The body is buried, judgment belongs to God, and political struggle moves on to the living. But in this case, say, the body itself became the battlefield. Formosus was not remembered peacefully because too much power still depended on what his papacy had meant. His death had not resolved the struggle around him. It had only stripped him of the ability to defend himself, making the corpse more useful than the man. And that is the central horror of the story. The dead pope could not speak, but the living could speak through him. They could position the body, accuse it, condemn it, and symbolically reverse the legitimacy of his acts. The corpse became a legal and political instrument. What was being tried was not simply a man, but ordinations, alliances, authority, and the right to rewrite a recent past by staging its disgrace in public ritual form. The dead body turned into a document that enemies wanted amended. What makes this especially unsettling is how fully ceremony was used to force the dead back into politics. This was not private vengeance. It was formalized. Vestments, throne, accusations, ecclesiastical setting, everything gave the appearance of order. But that order only intensified the obscenity. The church, an institution meant to govern souls and sacred continuity, was using a corpse to dramatize factional hatred. The dead were no longer at peace. They were being conscripted into the theatre of power. There is also something uniquely chilling about the visual logic of the event. A decaying body seated in judgment's place is already enough to disturb any historical imagination. But the deeper terror lies in what it reveals. If institutions become unstable enough, even death does not guarantee release from political use. The corpse can still be handled, stripped, condemned, and reburied according to the needs of whoever controls the ritual. Memory itself becomes physical abuse. That is why Formosus belongs on this list. His body did not merely survive him. It actively changed the living by exposing the depth of papal and aristocratic conflict in a period when legitimacy felt fragile enough to require symbolic violence against the dead. The Cadaver Synod did not restore order cleanly. It scandalized, destabilized, and helped reveal just how corrupted the struggle for power had become. The corpse altered the emotional and political atmosphere simply by being made visible again. In the end, the corpse of Pope Formosus belongs here because it shows one of history's most grotesque truths. Sometimes the dead continue shaping the living, not through holiness or heroism, but through the desperate need of the living to punish, erase, or rewrite them. Formosus died once. His body was forced to endure history a second time. Number 5. Eva Perón's embalmed body. Some dead continue changing the living because their remains are revered in sacred space. Eva Perón changed the living because her body became trapped inside politics, devotion, and national myth all at once. That is what makes her embalmed remain so powerful. She was already far more than a politician's wife while alive. To many Argentines, she was hope, protection, emotion, class loyalty, and almost saint-like intimacy in public life. When she died in 1952, the body did not become still in the historical sense. It became the site where grief, power, and control over memory collided. That is what gave the embalmed body such force. Embalming in this case was not simply preservation. It was an attempt to hold charisma against decay. Eva's corpse was prepared with extraordinary care, almost as if politics itself refused to accept that the body sustaining her public image should disappear into ordinary death. This is one of the darkest powers of embalming when joined to mass emotion. It turns mourning into suspension. The dead person remains visibly present enough that the nation does not have to complete the psychological work of letting go. And because Eva had become such an emotionally charged figure, her preserved body quickly exceeded the boundaries of normal funeral culture. To supporters, it could function as an object of near-devotional attachment. To enemies, it was a dangerous symbol that might keep Peronism alive through death. That is why the body became politically unstable. It was no longer only the remains of a beloved figure. It was a contested asset in the struggle over Argentina itself. What makes the case especially haunting is the body's later movement through secrecy, concealment, and displacement. Rather than resting securely in one fixed national shrine, the embalmed remains entered a strange afterlife of hiding, transport, and symbolic management. This tells us something crucial. The dead become historically dangerous when the living cannot agree on what their body is allowed to mean. Eva's corpse had to be controlled because her memory was not controllable enough. The body became the last physical concentration of a political force many wanted either to preserve forever or erase from public feeling. There is also something uniquely eerie about the contrast between preservation and helplessness. Embalming gives the dead a kind of visual endurance, but it also intensifies vulnerability. A preserved body can be moved, stored, hidden, guarded, and used in ways that ordinary burial would prevent. The person seems almost present, yet cannot resist anything done in the name of memory. That tension gives Eva Perón's afterlife much of its emotional power. The body appears close to life, but only so that the living can keep fighting over it. That is why she belongs this high on the list. Eva's body did not merely symbolize political afterlife in the abstract. It actively shaped the emotional and political landscape by forcing successive regimes and movements to decide what would happen to the woman who had become too powerful to disappear cleanly. The corpse kept influencing Argentina precisely because the nation had not decided whether she was to be mourned, worshipped, hidden, or neutralized. In the end, Eva Perón's embalmed body belongs on this list because it reveals how a dead body can become more than a memorial and less than a relic, occupying a uniquely modern zone where mass politics, grief, class feeling, and national myth all fight for possession. She died, but the body kept altering the living because it held something they could neither bury peacefully nor release from history. Number 4. The Tomb of Timur and the War Omen Legend. Some dead continue changing the living through relics, shrines, or embalmed presence. Timur's tomb did it through warning. That is what makes this case so unnerving. Timur was already one of history's most feared conquerors, a ruler whose legacy was built from empire, terror, and the disciplined use of violence on an enormous scale. His burial should have fixed him in the past. Instead, later generations came to believe that even disturbing his tomb could set disaster back in motion. That is what gives the legend its force. A tomb is supposed to contain power by sealing it. But when a ruler's grave becomes associated with a curse or omen, burial starts looking less like closure and more like unstable containment. The dead conqueror is no longer simply remembered. He is treated as though he still possesses a dangerous relationship to the future. The message becomes simple and chilling: leave the grave alone, or history will answer. What makes the Timur legend especially potent is the way it intersects with modern catastrophe. The most famous version centers on the opening of his tomb in 1941, shortly before Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Whether one treats that sequence as coincidence, retrospective pattern-making, or something more symbolically powerful, the emotional effect is undeniable. Once the story was told, the dead conqueror seemed to have re-entered history at the exact moment another vast war of devastation began. The past and present locked together too neatly for many people to ignore, and that is how the dead begin altering the living. The tomb becomes a site not only of archaeology or memory, but of dread. A technical act, opening a burial, acquires the emotional charge of transgression. The living start interpreting geopolitical catastrophe through the disturbed remains of a medieval emperor. That shift matters because it transforms how people imagine causation. War may still have political causes, but the legend offers an additional moral script. Some dead are not meant to be touched carelessly because the violence attached to them has not fully gone cold. There is also something especially appropriate about Timur in this role. He was not a saint, martyr, or beloved symbol of healing. He was a conqueror whose name already carried fear. That means his tomb legend works through continuity of character. A peaceful ruler cursed from beyond the grave would feel strange. Timur feels different. The imagination almost expects that a man who altered continents through force might remain dangerous, even in burial. The legend does not humanize him. It preserves him as threat. That is why the case belongs on this list. The dead here are not changing the living by offering comfort or legitimacy. They are changing them through interpretation, through the fear that history's violent figures may continue radiating consequence after death if their boundaries are violated. A grave becomes a warning device. Archaeology becomes omen. A conqueror's remains become part of the emotional vocabulary of modern war. In the end, the tomb of Timur belongs here because it shows how easily a dead ruler can become active again in the minds of the living when catastrophe follows too closely behind disturbance. Whether curse, coincidence, or myth built from timing, the result is the same. The tomb no longer feels like the end of Timur's story. It feels like a sealed door history opened at its own risk. Number 3. The body of Lenin. Some dead continue influencing the living because people pray to them. Lenin did it because the state would not let him disappear. That is what makes his body one of the most powerful political corpses in modern history. He was not buried in the ordinary sense. He was preserved, displayed, guarded, and turned into a permanent revolutionary presence at the heart of Soviet power. The body did not simply commemorate Lenin, it kept him physically available to ideology. That is what gives the case its eerie force. A revolution usually promises a new world, but every new world has a problem with death. Founders die, charisma decays, memory fragments. Lenin's embalmed body offered a solution that was both practical and deeply unsettling. The revolution could claim continuity not just through texts, statues, or institutions, but through the visible remains of the leader himself. The body became a secular relic, but one serving a political faith rather than a religious cult in the old sense. What makes this especially haunting is how carefully the system built around the corpse mimicked sacred permanence while insisting on modern political meaning. The mausoleum was not a grave of disappearance. It was a site of controlled encounter. Citizens, officials, foreign visitors, and generations of Soviet subjects could move past Lenin's preserved form and receive the same lesson. The founder is dead, but not absent. The state can still place him before your eyes. That is an extraordinary power, and that power matters because a preserved body changes time. Burial allows historical transition. Display resists it. As long as Lenin's corpse remained publicly maintained, the revolution's beginning never entirely receded into the past. The Soviet state could continue staging origin as presence. This is one of the darkest functions the dead can serve for the living. They can hold a political order in symbolic suspension, preventing full separation between founding event and ongoing authority. There is also something deeply revealing about the labor required to keep the body available. Preservation, maintenance, scientific care, ceremonial setting, controlled light, architectural framing. None of this is passive. A political corpse does not remain powerful by accident. The living must keep making it powerful. That means Lenin's body continued changing the living not only as symbol, but as institution. Entire systems of care, display, and reverence developed around a dead man whose physical endurance had become part of the state's emotional grammar. What makes Lenin more unsettling than many saintly relics is that the body's purpose was explicitly historical and ideological. This was not primarily about miracles or intercession. It was about continuity, legitimacy, and the visual proof that revolutionary authority could outlast natural decay. The corpse became argument. If Lenin could still be seen, then Leninism could still claim immediacy. The body held open a political present that might otherwise have begun fading into memorial distance. And yet there is always something unstable in that arrangement. A preserved leader is powerful but also vulnerable to reinterpretation. The longer the body remains, the more generations may ask what exactly they are looking at. Reverence, control, denial of mortality, political theatre, or some fusion of all four. That ambiguity only deepens the case's power. The corpse remains, and each era reads it differently, but no era can fully treat it as neutral. In the end, the body of Lenin belongs at number 3 because it reveals one of the purest forms of the dead continuing to govern the living. He did not return through legend or curse. He returned through preservation, display, and the state's decision to keep his body inside public history rather than beneath it. That made Lenin more than a memory. It made him an ongoing physical presence in the political life of the living. Number 2. The relics of Joan of Arc. Some dead continue changing the living because their bodies are preserved. Joan of Arc is more unsettling because her physical afterlife was shaped by destruction, absence, and the desperate need of later generations to recover what fire had supposedly erased. That is what makes her relics so powerful. She was executed as a heretic, burned so that the body would not become a shrine and meant to disappear into judicial finality. But history refused that ending. The very effort to destroy her body helped create one of the most charged afterlives in European memory. That is what gives Joan's case such force. A saintly or national figure whose body survives can be venerated directly. Joan's body, by contrast, became powerful partly through loss. The flames that were meant to erase her instead intensified the hunger for material traces. Ashes, fragments, supposed remains, clothing associations, places of execution, and later relic claims all became charged with the impossible desire to hold on to someone the authorities had tried to annihilate physically as well as spiritually. The dead woman became more dangerous because destruction itself failed to close the story. What makes this especially haunting is the instability of the relic tradition around her. With Joan, the question is never only whether a relic is authentic. It is why people needed her relics to exist so badly. That need reveals how completely she escaped the purpose of her execution. The court had condemned her, fire had consumed the body. Yet later France, later Catholic devotion, and later historical imagination kept pulling her back into visibility. Bones or fragments associated with her were not just devotional curiosities. They were material challenges to the sentence meant to define her forever. and that is where the dead begin changing the living in a profound way. Joan's remains, or alleged remains, did not function only as objects. They became sites where memory, nationalism, sanctity, and political identity could meet. She was too useful, too pure in retrospective imagination, and too emotionally potent to remain only a trial transcript ending in smoke. The body had to return somehow, even if only through uncertain fragments, preserved stories, and the relic logic that says what the fire could not fully destroy may still carry presence. There is also something uniquely powerful about Joan, because her life already stood at the intersection of war, religion, gender, monarchy, and revelation. Once such a figure dies violently, the body becomes almost unbearable in its symbolic density. If relics can be attached to her, then heaven seems to answer the injustice of the stake. If relic claims survive, then the authorities who tried to make her vanish physically have failed in the most visible way. The remains become a reversal of condemnation. That is why Joan belongs so high on this list. Her relic Afterlife shows that the dead can continue ruling emotional and historical life, even when the body has supposedly been denied to posterity. The living kept trying to recover her, materially and spiritually, because she would not stay where the execution had placed her. The saint, the patriot, the visionary, and the victim all kept returning through the unresolved desire for contact. In the end, the relics of Joan of Arc belong here because they reveal one of history's deepest refusals. A regime tried to burn a woman out of memory. Instead, later generations kept searching for the body, the traces, the ash, the fragments, anything that would prove the fire had not won completely. That is how the dead keep changing the living, not only through what remains, but through the need to believe something of them still does. Number 1. The Death Mask of Tutankhamun and the Curse Afterlife. Some dead keep changing the living through devotion or politics. Tutankhamun did it through one of the most powerful combinations in all of history: beauty, burial, empire, media, and curse. That is why he stands at number 1. The young pharaoh himself had been relatively minor in the scale of ancient Egyptian rule. But once his tomb was opened in 1922 and the golden funerary world inside emerged before the modern eye, he ceased to be merely a dead king. He became an afterlife event. That is what gave the case such extraordinary force. The death mask alone carried enough visual power to alter modern imagination permanently. Gold, lapis, serenity, royal stillness, and the terrifying elegance of a face built to outlast death, all of it made the dead seem not absent, but preserved in a form almost too perfect for ordinary mourning. Tutankhamun's remains and funerary mask did not merely reveal ancient burial custom. They staged death as permanence. The modern world looked at the mask and saw not a lost boy king alone, but the ancient dream of surviving decay through sacred splendor. And then the curse story entered. Deaths and illnesses connected, however loosely, to those involved in the tomb's discovery, were woven into a narrative that suggested the pharaoh's burial had not been neutralized by time. This is where the dead began changing the living in a uniquely modern way. Newspapers amplified fear. The public devoured the idea that a long-buried king might still strike back. Archaeology, imperial extraction, spiritual unease, and modern mass media fused into one of the most durable legends of the 20th century. The dead king was no longer only an archaeological subject. He was a warning. What makes this case especially unsettling is that the curse did not need to be historically strong in order to be emotionally overwhelming. The excavation happened in an age already fascinated by Egypt, occultism, empire, and the idea that ancient secrets might punish modern arrogance. Tutankhamun's tomb gave all those desires a physical center. The mask, the sarcophagus, the chambers, the body, these were too beautiful, too sealed, too intimate with death not to invite the suspicion that opening them must have consequences beyond scholarship. The pharaoh seemed to have crossed into modernity without surrendering his ancient power. That is why the mask matters so much. A tomb can be abstract. A death mask creates encounter. It is the face of the dead made eternal enough to look back. And once the dead appear to look back, they stop feeling passive. Tutankhamun's image has ruled museum culture, visual memory, documentary imagination, and popular fear for a century precisely because it makes ancient burial feel alive with intention. The face says preservation. The legend says retaliation. Together they create one of the strongest afterlives anybody has ever achieved. There is also a deeper historical discomfort here. The tomb's opening belongs to the age of imperial archaeology, when the modern world often approached ancient burial as treasure waiting for extraction, cataloguing, and display. The curse legend functioned, in part, like a moral counterweight to that confidence. It said, perhaps the dead are not simply there for us to open. Perhaps the past can resist. Whether literally true or not, that emotional possibility changed how millions of people imagined archaeology itself. The dead king altered the living by teaching them to fear reverence arriving too late. That is why Tutankhamun stands at number 1. He shows the dead at their most complete historical power. His body, tomb, and mask changed museums, media, popular imagination, the global image of ancient Egypt, and the emotional grammar of curses all at once. He did not need to move. He did not need to speak. The face, the gold, and the opened tomb were enough to convince the modern world that some dead do not enter history quietly. They enter it looking immortal and leave the living wondering whether they were ever meant to be disturbed at all.